Thank you. It's sort of like amazing that there's a whole conference on storytelling and storytellers. I think the more amazing part is why all conferences aren't about storytelling and storytellers. I think stories can change our lives. I know they've changed mine, ways in which I think about who I am and the world in which I live. So I took seriously Saul's suggestion to use this as an opportunity to not tell something I've told 1,000 times before, but to do something new. So when I thought about telling a new story today, it was both something that hasn't been shared before, but also something that's recent, something that I hadn't fully made sense of, because if it's too far in the past, I've had the benefit of hindsight to wrap it up with a nice little bow. So I was going to try to find something where I was still wrestling with it. I have plenty of old stories that I could tell, and that really marked who I am and how I make sense of the world. I was in high school, I skipped lunch a whole lot of times because I was too embarrassed that my friends would figure out I was a free lunch kid, and they'd see me pull a blue ticket out of my pocket instead of a white ticket. I was in college, and some kids in my dorm asked me to tutor them in math, assuming I was good in math. I taught in the Bronx, and one time after class, the students came up to me and they asked me if I would stop doing projects in class. They said, "We think you think we're smarter than we really are, and would just lecture at us because that's all we're able to do," and that really broke my heart. And then I worked at a nonprofit in New York in a big office building, and when I started, I would go out for lunch and I'd get some takeout to come back and eat at my desk, and the security desk would always ask me to take the freight elevator up, and sure, no problem. It wasn't until a month later I realized they didn't know that I was a new PhD doing research. They thought I was the delivery boy. All things that have happened in my life, all defining moments. So I wanted to think of a story in that spirit that I could tell you today, and something that was new, something from the past 5 years. And I had nothing. I could not think of a story in that same spirit. So I'm going to spend my time today telling you why I don't have a story to tell you. So I was going to frame this in terms of the hero's journey. So some of you might be familiar with this. This is Joseph Conrad popularized this. And we heard earlier about finding your own superpower, your superhero inside. And I want to walk through the basic structure. I'm going to ask you to help fill in the blanks. Since I couldn't come up with a story, I'm going to ask you to come up with a story. And in your head, it's like you're having your own Biff summit, like you have your own Beyonce headset on, and you're telling a story, so you can do that. So I'm going to ask you to think of some adventure that you went on where you went out and you had a decisive crisis and you came back a changed person. We all have some version of that. Maybe it's when you moved away from home for the first time, or maybe when you got involved with some big social cause, or just a big change in your personal or professional life. So that's what I'm going to have you imagine. I'm going to walk through the structure just so you're reminded of how these stories typically go. So the first step is the introduction to the ordinary world. And this is where we understand the uneventful normalcy of your regular everyday life. And you might have some characteristic or ability that makes you feel slightly out of place, but that's where we start our story. Everyone has that in their heads? Right. The next step is called the call to adventure. In this case, you're pulled from that known world. You're going to start to enter an unknown world. And there might be some discovery or an event or some danger, something that gets you instigated to take on this adventure. And you might be reluctant. You might not want to leave your family, your friends, or your home, but at some point you decide, I'm going to pursue that destiny. Next is crossing the threshold, and that's when you enter this unknown world. And there might be different sights or people or ways in which you're understanding what's going on. Most importantly, there are different rules you need to figure out in this different world. Now, here's the main part of the story, typically. These are the challenges and temptations. This is where you find out what the rules are of this other world. And you're going to test your endurance, your strength, your mettle as you try to figure this out. And you might have some magical aides or allies who help you along the way. But the key thing, you might fail some of these tests, you might succumb to some of these temptations, but you learn everything you need in order to take on what we'd call the final conflict. And the final conflict, that's where everything comes into play. You have the final showdown. This is like Luke facing the Death Star or Dorothy facing the Wicked Witch. This is where we can have this final culmination. Now, probably if all of you are playing along, you're the hero of the story, so you are successful, I hope. And but it's not over yet. There's still more to go. The next step is where you get a reward, the treasure from completing that final conflict, and you get a big change, a transformation. In this case, your change is complete. You are more comfortable with who you are, and you're comfortable with who you are in the world in which you live. Finally, there's a return home. You take your treasure, you go back to where you came, and you might be celebrated, you might be shunned, but you've now completed this journey, and you're just going to wait for the next journey to begin. So this is the hero's journey as we typically might think about it. So my question for myself is why couldn't I come up with a hero's journey over the past 5 years? Now, over the past 5 years, I did have a major change in my life. I switched over and I started working in philanthropy, as Saul said, worked at the Hewlett Foundation. And I thought this would be ripe for a great story because it's a whole new career change for me. So let me just walk through and we'll see why I could not figure out a good story here. Now, my ordinary world was working at a nonprofit in New York City, so it's pretty basic. And then the next step as my call to adventure, it was actually incredibly quick. I had heard about this job, I sent in my CV, the search consultant called me, and the director interviewed me, the staff interviewed me. It was like 2.5 weeks later, I had a job offer. Like, I was crazy fast. So I had no chance to reflect on what was happening there. And then when we have crossing the threshold, the foundation is actually back in the Bay Area where I grew up. And the offices are on the campus of Stanford University on the very outer edge where I did my graduate work. So this is returning to a place I knew that wasn't this strange land I didn't understand. And my prior life experience, I had been an educational practitioner who did professional development for teachers. I'd been an academic researcher, and I had done assessment work. Like in this new world, my grantees were educational practitioners doing professional development, academic researchers, and assessment folks. So like this is exactly the people I knew. So it wasn't like this strange land I needed to figure out. So this is usually the first act of a movie. If this were the movie of my life, like this is like 1 minute, 10 seconds, like that Katy Perry song that's underlying the opening credits, like you wouldn't even get to the whole song. There's so much that needs to happen, and that was it. So, next, I figured, well, maybe it's in the tests, the challenges, the temptations I would face. Maybe this is where the bulk of my story would emerge. And there are all sorts of ways in which we'd face challenges, face tests, and also be tempted by different things. And I thought I'd systematically go through these temptations to figure out, where is the bulk of the story that should be there, but I couldn't figure out. So I systematically went through. I started with, here's a familiar list, I started with lust. Sometimes we go after shiny new things, but at the foundation, we've been working on some problems for 50 years, so we try to stick with things which are really important and stay with them, so that didn't seem like an interesting place to go for my story. Might try envy, we might covet what other folks are funding, what other foundations are focusing on, but there's so much collaboration and group work that we do together in philanthropy, there didn't seem to be an interesting element there. Like gluttony, it is true that our investment teams tries to grow our investment, so we now have a $9 billion investment. However, if we flip over to greed, our job is to give away that money. By law, we give away a percentage of that every year, so money comes in and money goes right back out. So again, not a great story there. And then we might think of sloth. So we take these projects on for a long period of time, so you think there might be a chance just to sit back and let things happen whenever they happen. But we have term limits. I have 8 years, so I need to get stuff done while I can get stuff done. So this didn't seem like an interesting angle either. Pride. At the Hewlett Foundation, we think it's most important that our grantees work first, and we step to the background. So we think they're the ones who should be celebrated and not us. So this didn't seem like a reasonable way to approach a story either. And then finally, we have wrath. Now, I work with the most amazing colleagues in the world, and I have the chance to work with the most passionate, intelligent, smart grantees ever. Who exactly am I going to try to get revenge on? So that didn't seem to work either. So, this is, you can see why I was stuck. I have no good story to tell. But then I realized, as I thought through, another challenge here is I enable other folks to do the work that they do. So I give them grants and they execute. And so I am not the one who's coming up with a new, as we heard earlier, a new way to think about airlines, or not a way to have a food program for the homeless. I give money to folks. My job is to read a report on it and file it. So again, I don't have that great stuff to show you today because of that. I did think maybe I should cede my time to the cellist and bring him back, because that's way more interesting than my story would have been. So then I thought through, what's the final conflict? Maybe this is where it is, and it's not quite there yet, but my personal narrative has always been about being far from opportunity, struggling against the system to try to make do with what I can. And I don't think I realized that the unknown world I had entered into was not the Hewlett Foundation, and it wasn't philanthropy. It was actually a world of privilege I had not had access to before. And because I sped so quickly through the first act of this story, I didn't have a chance to reflect on what that actually meant. So from a place of privilege, I think my stories suddenly become so much more boring because it's so much more interesting when you're scrappy and trying to get your way through the system. So I realized that in many ways, like the challenges I faced and the temptations that I was treated against, they're on a higher level of Maslow. So although most of my life I've been focused on trying to get food and shelter, like now I'm in a world where getting food is trying to find locally sourced, gluten-free, organic food, and people are trying to like mid-century modern shelter. So like that is like so foreign to me. And then if I try to achieve self-actualization, like I can get an executive coach to help me do that too. So there's a way in which like a whole different world. Then when I think about the prizes I get because I'm working in this place, oddly enough, I'm back to being a free lunch kid. But that's because the foundation caters in lunch every day for us to have. So there's this way in which I've been upgraded to first class, but I'm caring about the folks who are back in coach. And it seems really hard for me. It's in tension with the way in which I've grown up, in tension with my previous stories. So when I try to work in philanthropy, I do realize who's changed me. Somehow, when you work in philanthropy, suddenly you're the smartest, funniest person in the room. And I worry if folks are being nice to me because of who I am or because I have a checkbook. And that's a real concern. I mean, it's compounded when I face a life living with outright racism and outright classism, where people were not assuming nice things about me when I walked into the room. So this is so in tension with who I am. I also know my time in this world of privilege is temporary, because I'm a temporary steward of the funds of the foundation, and I have a term limit, and I will leave this world, and I won't leave it with all these resources. So there's this way in which I know I will no longer be invited to the White House. Well, I'm not invited to the White House now anymore, but anyway, I don't get that. My temporary stay in this world is like my philanthropic flowers for Algernon. My dorm mate should have asked me to tutor them in literacy instead of like math. But anyway, so what do I bring back to the world from whence I came? I know that in a lot of the work that I do, I've been trying to hack education. So a grant that I actually made to BIF was to think about what that looks like. How do we help scrappy schools figure out ways they can improve their work using the resources that they have? And that's clearly linked back to who I am and my experience. I've done work to try to spread and scale like really important practices in education. So the students in the Bronx get to do that, as well as the kid like me who was in a really crummy public high school get access to that as well. And I've invested in equity leadership, ways in which that people of color and people who fight for people of color have a chance to participate and not be asked to ride in the freight elevator. So my job at Hewlett has helped me realize that my hero's journey is different from the one I've had before. As I said when I started, I actually believe that stories can change someone's life. I think there's an amazing power that they have there. But what I didn't realize is that if you change someone's life, that doesn't change the way in which they want to tell good stories. There's a powerful way in which storytelling and the stories that you tell are linked to who you are, and one external shift is not going to change the internal one. Thank you.